Welcome back, my friend. The lamps are lit, the wind has quieted, and somewhere in the shadows the Niffler has found something shiny again. But this time, it's not gold. It's a story. And tonight, he's ready to share it with you. So settle in and listen closely. It begins like this.
Mist lay across the lake like a shroud of silver silk. Eilis Cormyran stood at the window of her small stone dwelling, clutching a cup of herbal draught that had long since gone cold. Dawn barely penetrated the thick veil of moisture, painting the sky in shades of ash and pale rose. 3 years. 3 long years had passed since Kaelin had gone, yet every morning felt as though it had happened yesterday. Her fingers unconsciously rubbed the edge of the cup, old with a crack along the side, the very same one from which Kaelin had always drunk his morning infusion of mint and lemon balm. She could not bring herself to throw this cup away, could not throw away any of his things. The house had frozen in time, like an enchanted repository of memories, where everything remained exactly as it had been on that final day. Eilis turned from the window and swept her gaze across the room. The fire in the hearth barely smoldered. She had forgotten to add wood the previous evening. The air was cool, permeated with moisture from the lake and the scent of old timber. On the shelves stood her books, manuscripts of charms she had once diligently studied and created. Now they gathered dust. Her wand lay upon the table, beside an unfinished preservation charm she had been working on 3 months ago and never completed. Magic seemed hollow without him. Eilis set the cup upon the windowsill and touched her fingers to the cold glass. The lake beneath the morning mist appeared boundless, mysterious. It was here, on the shore of this lake, that Kaelin had first told her he loved her. It had been 12 years ago, on a warm summer evening, when the air smelled of water lilies and fresh wind. He had taken her hand, and his palm had been warm, strong, so very alive. Now all that remained were memories. She stepped away from the window, forcing herself to move. If she did not move, she might freeze forever, become a spectre in her own home. Eilis walked down the corridor, passing the door to his workroom. It was closed. Always closed. She had not entered since then. In the kitchen, she mechanically set about preparing breakfast, though she had no appetite. She sliced bread, fetched cheese, spread butter. Automatic movements, devoid of any meaning. She ate because one had to eat. She lived because one had to live. But why? Outside the window, a raven's cry rang out. A sharp, alarming sound tore through the silence, and Eilis flinched. Ravens. Kaelin had always said that ravens were harbingers of change. He loved watching them, studying their behavior, believing them to be cleverer than most people thought. Suddenly, through the veil of memories, she heard his voice. "Eilis, don't forget to water the rosemary on the windowsill," Kaelin explained, leaning over his herbs. "It withers, without proper care." She looked around. The room was empty. Of course, empty. But the voice had been so real, so clear, that her heart hammered as though gone mad. This had been happening more and more frequently in recent months. She heard his voice in the wind, in the rustling of leaves, in the crackling of the fire. She saw his silhouette in shadows, in the shapes of clouds, in the movements of passers-by at the market. Eilis covered her face with her palms. She had to stop this, had to let go. But how? How could one let go of a person who had been half of one's soul? That day she decided to go to the settlement. Perhaps a change of surroundings would help. Perhaps speaking with other people would distract her from the endless cycle of memories. Eilis donned her cloak, took her basket, and set off along the path that led through the forest to the small settlement where other witches and wizards lived. The forest greeted her with coolness and the scent of damp earth. The trees stood tall and slender, their leaves rustling in the wind, creating a melody that Eilis had once loved. Kaelin often brought her here, showing her rare plants that grew in the shade, explaining their properties. He could talk about plants for hours, and his eyes shone with excitement when he spoke of yet another discovery. "Look, Eilis, this is pale wolfspan," he would say, crouching beside a small blue flower. "Its root has unique properties. It can stop bleeding in a matter of seconds. But one must know how to gather it properly. otherwise the magic dissipates. She stopped at the very place where pale wolfspan once grew. The flowers were still there, though now they looked somehow different without his caring gaze. Eilis crouched and reached out to touch the delicate petals with her fingers. Cold. Everything was so cold without him. When she finally reached the settlement, the sun had risen high, dispersing the morning mist. The settlement was small, a few dozen houses scattered across the hillsides. Here lived mostly wizards, who, like Eilis and Kaelin, sought a quiet life far from the great magical centers. The market square was filled with people. Merchants displayed their wares, enchanted candles that never went out, herbal infusions for various ailments, protective amulets, rare ingredients for potions. Eilis walked slowly between the stalls, barely noticing what surrounded her. People greeted her. Some tried to strike up conversation, but she answered briefly, evasively. She did not want to talk, did not want to explain how she felt. Everyone already knew. In such a small settlement, it was impossible to hide pain. Near the fabric stall, she saw a young couple, a man and woman laughing, holding hands. Something in the man's gesture, in the way he gently brushed a strand of hair from his wife's face, made Eilis's heart clench painfully. She turned away, quickening her pace. "Eilis," she heard a familiar voice. It was Adrian, an older witch who lived on the outskirts of the settlement. She was a healer, like Kaelin, though her speciality lay more in charms than in herbs. "Adrian," Eilis said, attempting a smile. "How are you, child?" Adrian asked, and in her eyes was genuine concern. "I live," Eilis answered simply. "That is already something," Adrian said gently. She paused, then added, "You know, I understand that it is not easy, but time helps, little by little." Eilis nodded, though she did not believe these words. 3 years had passed, and the pain had not lessened. It had simply changed, become duller, more corrosive. They spoke a while longer, and Eilis finally stepped away, feeling exhausted from this brief interaction. She wanted to return home, to her solitude, to her memories. As she was leaving the settlement, she saw him again. At least so it seemed to her, a man in a brown cloak, with the same build, the same gait. He stood with his back to her, speaking with someone by the stable. Eilis's heart stopped. She knew it was not him, knew it was impossible. But her feet carried her forward of their own accord. "Kaelin," she whispered. The man turned. His face was entirely different. Younger, coarser, bearded. He raised his eyebrows in surprise. "Pardon me, madam." Eilis stepped back, feeling her face burn with shame and disappointment. "Forgive me. I was mistaken." She hurried away, not looking back. Tears stung her eyes, but she did not allow them to fall. Not here. Not in front of everyone. Blank. The road home seemed endless. When Eilis finally opened the door of her dwelling, the sun was already slanting towards the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and bronze. She shed her cloak, set down the empty basket. She had bought nothing, and wandered aimlessly through the rooms. Her feet led her of their own accord to the door of his workroom. She stopped, placing her palm upon the cold wood. 3 years. 3 years she had not crossed this threshold. What lay there, beyond this door? His world, his dreams, his unfinished work. Eilis took a deep breath and pressed down on the handle. The door opened soundlessly, and she was met by a smell: old paper, dried herbs, wax from candles. Half darkness reigned in the room. The window faced north, and sunlight barely reached here. Eilis stepped inside, and memories crashed over her in an avalanche. Everything remained as he had left it. The table, cluttered with paper, parchments, books. Shelves with jars where dried plants, roots, seeds were stored. On the wall hung dried branches of rare trees he had used for his experiments. In the corner stood his workrobe, neatly hung on a hook. Eilis approached the table. Dust had settled in a thick layer on everything. She reached out and touched one of the parchments. These were his notes, careful, clear handwriting that she knew better than her own. He was describing the properties of some plant, making sketches, adding notes. Then her gaze fell upon something else. In the corner of the table, beneath several sheets of paper, the edge of something peeked out. Eilis carefully moved the papers aside and froze. It was a drawing. Unfinished, a pencil sketch, drawn on rough paper. On it was she. Eilis recognized herself immediately. The features of her face, the shape of her eyes, the line of her lips. Kaelan had been drawing her. He had been drawing her portrait, but the drawing was incomplete. The face was rendered in detail, whilst the hair and background remained only light sketches, barely marked lines. At the bottom, in the corner, stood a date. 2 days before his death. Eilis's hands trembled as she lifted the drawing. It was light, like a breath of wind. Kaelan had always had a talent for drawing. Not magical, but ordinary, human. He loved capturing the beauty of the world on paper, said it helped him see details that others missed. But this drawing, he had not managed to finish it, had not managed to complete what he had begun. Like everything else in his life, something inside Eilis cracked. Some final wall she had been carefully building around her heart over these 3 years suddenly collapsed. The tears she had held back for so long finally broke free. She pressed the drawing to her chest and fell to her knees right there, in the middle of the room, amongst the dust and memories. "Kaelan," she whispered through tears. "Kaelan, why did you go? Why did you leave me?" But there was no answer. Only silence. Empty, terrible silence. She did not know how long she sat there on the floor, holding that unfinished drawing. Twilight thickened to darkness. The moon rose over the lake, illuminating the room with pale silver light. Finally, Eilis rose. Her legs had gone numb, her eyes burned from tears, but something new had been born within. Not hope, not yet hope, but resolve. She could not bring him back. It was impossible. Death was absolute, and no magic could truly resurrect the dead. She knew this. Every wizard knew this. But what if there was another way? Eilis looked at the unfinished drawing. Kaelan had wanted to preserve her image on paper, had wanted something of her to remain, even when she was not near. And what if one could do more? What if one could preserve not merely an image, but the very essence of a person, their personality, their voice, their memories? It was a mad thought, absurd, but it would not let go. Eilis slowly left the workroom, carrying the drawing with her. She walked to her own work table, lit candles and unrolled clean parchments. Her wand lay where she had left it. Eilis took it, feeling the familiar warmth of wood in her palm. Magic. Her magic had always been about preserving knowledge, transmitting information, fixing moments in time through spells and charms. What if these principles could be applied differently? What if one could create something that would preserve not merely information but the person themselves? She began to write. At first uncertainly, then faster, her hand racing across the parchment, recording thoughts, ideas, questions. It was impossible. It had to be impossible. But Eilis Cormyran had never been afraid of the impossible. If she could not bring Kaelan back, she would create a way to preserve him. Forever. The candles burned until morning, and Eilis wrote, filling page after page with her ideas. For the first time in 3 years, she felt something within her awakening. Not happiness, not yet happiness, but purpose, and that was enough to keep on living. The next day, Eilis woke at her work table, her head resting on her arms. Her neck ached, her back was stiff, but her mind was strangely clear. The parchments around her were covered with notes, diagrams, questions. The unfinished drawing of Kaelan lay nearby, and she gently touched it with her fingers. "I will find a way," she whispered. "I promise you, Kaelan. I will find a way to bring back at least a part of you." Outside, a raven's cry rang out again. Eilis approached the window and saw a majestic black bird settle on the branch of an old willow by the lake. It turned its head and looked directly at her, its eyes glinting in the morning light. Harbingers of change, she recalled Kaelan's words. Perhaps he had been right. Perhaps change was indeed approaching. Change that she herself would create. Eilis turned from the window and returned to her table. Ahead lay a long road. A road filled with uncertainty, doubts, possible failures. But she was ready. She would walk this road, no matter how difficult it might be. For him. For their love. for the possibility of hearing his voice once more, seeing his smile, feeling that he was near. Even if it would be only an echo. Even if it would be only a shadow. It would be better than emptiness. The first weeks Eilis spent immersed in her own library. Books she had collected over the years now opened before her with new purpose. She searched for any mention of preserving consciousness, of transmitting personality, of the boundary between life and death. Her parchments became covered with notes, diagrams, questions without answers. Preservation charms existed. She herself had created some of them. They allowed memories to be recorded in magical objects, knowledge to be stored for future generations. But this was merely information, cold facts without soul, without personality. She needed more. One evening, when the moon hung over the lake as a full silver disk, Eilis came across a mention of an ancient practice that wizards avoided speaking of aloud. Necromancy. The dark art of communing with the dead, of manipulating death and what lay beyond its veil. She stared at this paragraph in the old book for a long time, feeling something within her constrict with fear, and yet with greedy curiosity. Necromancy was forbidden magic, dangerous not only for those who practiced it, but for the world itself. But if there were answers there, Eilis closed the book and set it aside. Not today. Today she was not yet ready to step onto that path, but the seed had been sown. A month later, Eilis set out for Northumbria, where, according to rumor, an ancient library was kept, belonging to an order of wizard scholars. The journey was long and exhausting. She traveled part of the way on foot, then hired a horse, and walked the final miles through dense forest, where old trees grew so closely that sunlight barely penetrated their leaves. The library proved to be a massive stone structure, half hidden in the slope of a hill. The entrance was guarded by enchanted runes that shimmered with pale blue light, sensing the presence of magic. Eilis raised her wand and spoke an identification charm. The runes flared brighter, then slowly faded, allowing her inside. Within, coolness and silence reigned. The air smelled of old paper, leather, wax, and something else. Ancient magic that had seeped into every stone of this place. Along the walls stretched tall shelves, crammed with books, scrolls, manuscripts. Some of them were so old that their covers cracked at the slightest touch. The old librarian, a thin man with a long grey beard, rose from behind his desk as Eilis entered. His eyes were penetrating, filled with knowledge and caution. "How may I help you, madam?" he asked, his voice echoing in the spacious hall. "I am searching for information," Eilis replied, trying to speak confidently, "about preserving personality after death, about ways to preserve consciousness." The librarian looked at her for a long time, and in his gaze was something like compassion. "Loss?" he asked quietly. Eilis nodded, not trusting her voice. "Many come here with the same pain," he said, "and many leave disappointed, or worse than they were." "I understand the risks," Eilis answered. The librarian sighed. "Follow me." He led her deep into the library where on the lower shelves, covered with dusty cloth, stood books that clearly had not been touched for years. He retrieved one of them, a thick tome in black leather binding with tarnished silver runes on the spine. "This is one of the oldest treatises on necromancy," he explained, "written over 500 years ago by a wizard named Morcaine the Dark. He devoted his life to studying death, and in the end, lost himself in that study." Eilis took the book. It was heavy, cold to the touch, and something about it immediately felt wrong. The magic that permeated this tome was grim, thick as bog mist. "Be careful," the librarian warned. "Dark magic tempts with promises, but it always takes more than it gives." Eilis nodded and carried the book to a table by the window. The following days, she spent immersed in the dark world of necromancy. Morcaine wrote of various methods of communing with the dead, of rituals for summoning spirits, of spells that temporarily returned the deceased to the world of the living, but all of it was wrong. The spirits he summoned were only shadows, empty shells without true consciousness. The dead he revived were horrifying parodies of themselves, bodies without souls, controlled by magic rather than their own will. One story particularly struck Eilis. Morcaine described a wizard who had lost his daughter and attempted to bring her back using the darkest rituals. He created a body resembling hers, breathed magic into it, forced it to move and speak. But the creature he created was a monster. It had his daughter's face, but there was nothing human in its eyes. It knew no love, only hunger for the life that had been taken. Eilis closed the book, feeling nauseous. This was not it. This was not at all what she was searching for. She did not want to create a horrifying imitation of Callan. She wanted to preserve his true essence, his personality, his soul. But was it even possible? As she was leaving the library, the librarian stopped her at the door. "Did you find what you were looking for?" "No," Eilis answered honestly. "There are only horrors there." "Necromancy is always horrors," he said. "Because it attempts to violate the natural order of things. Death is part of life. Attempting to deceive it leads only to suffering." "Then what are those who cannot accept loss to do?" Eilis asked, and despair broke through in her voice. The old man looked at her with deep compassion. "Seek other paths," he replied. "Paths that do not violate the natural balance but work with it. There is wisdom in acceptance, and there is magic in memories." These words stayed with Eilis as she returned home, yet despair would not let go. Returning to her dwelling by the lake, Eilis plunged into even deeper research. She searched for mentions of legendary artifacts capable of conquering death, and finally found what she had heard only in whispers: the Resurrection Stone. Legend spoke of 3 deathly hallows, created by death itself for 3 brothers. One of them, the Resurrection Stone, supposedly could return the dead to the world of the living. Eilis knew this was most likely only a tale, but a desperate person grasps at even the smallest hope. She began seeking any mentions of the stone, spoke with other wizards, corresponded with scholars in distant lands, studied ancient manuscripts. Most people laughed at her or looked with pity. The Deathly Hallows were a fairy tale for children, an unreal myth. But one old witch Eilis met at the market told her a story. "My grandmother knew a man who supposedly saw the stone," she said, leaning closer. "He told that the stone truly returns the dead. But they return incomplete. They suffer, because they belong to another world. They are between life and death, and that is the worst place to be." Eilis listened, feeling cold spread down her spine. "He used the stone?" she asked. "Yes, brought back his beloved, and she begged him to let her go, because it hurt her to exist. He could not bear it, and in the end, destroyed the stone." This story, real or not, made Eilis think. Even if she found the Resurrection Stone, would she want to condemn Callan to such an existence, to suffering between 2 worlds? No, she loved him too much to do that to him. Months passed. Winter came to the highlands, covering the lake with ice and the forests with snow. Eilis continued her search, becoming ever more desperate. One evening, when the wind howled outside the windows and the fire in the hearth barely flickered, she decided to try something forbidden. In one of the books she had found in the Northumbria library, a spell for creating a spectral reflection was described. It did not summon the spirit of the deceased, but created a magical illusion based on the wizard's memories of the person. The spectral reflection could speak, move, even have a certain semblance of consciousness, whilst sustained by magic. But this spell belonged to the dark arts. It required blood, the use of forbidden magic, and even the author warned that prolonged use of this spell could damage the soul of the one who cast it. Eilis sat at the table, staring at the parchment with the spell. Her wand lay nearby. All she had to do was begin. Simply begin, and she would see Callan again, hear his voice, feel his presence. She stood, took her wand, her hands trembled, her heart hammered so loudly it seemed to fill the entire space of the room. Eilis raised her wand, preparing to speak the first word of the spell, and suddenly stopped. What was she doing? This was not Callan. It would be only an illusion, created from her memories and dark magic, a mirage that would look like him, speak like him, but would not have his true soul. And worse, it would damage her. Dark magic always left scars. Callan would not have wanted this. He would never have wanted her to lose herself for his sake. Eilis lowered her wand. Tears streamed down her face, but she felt relief. No, she would not go down this path. She would not lose herself in darkness. But what remained then? The next morning there came a knock at her door. Eilis started. She rarely received guests. When she opened the door, she saw an unfamiliar woman. Older, with long grey hair falling to her shoulders, with a face lined with the wrinkles of time, but with eyes that shone with deep wisdom. "Eilis Cormyran?" the woman asked in a quiet but clear voice. "Yes. And you?" "My name is Morgana. I have heard of your search. May I come in?" Eilis hesitated, but something about this woman inspired trust. She stepped back, allowing the guest inside. Morgana surveyed the room, her gaze lingering on the books, scattered parchments, on the unfinished drawing of Kaelin that lay on the table. "You have lost someone dear," she said. It was not a question. "My husband," Eilis answered quietly. "And now you seek a way to bring him back." "Yes." Morgana slowly sat in the chair by the hearth, where Eilis hastily rekindled the fire. She stretched her hands towards the flames, warming them. "I too have lost," she said after a long pause. "My son. He died when he was only 20 years old. A talented wizard, a good person. And I, like you, tried to find a way to bring him back." Eilis sat opposite her, all attention. "What did you do?" "At first, the same as you. Studied necromancy, sought dark rituals, tried to deceive death. But every path led only to emptiness. The dead do not return, Eilis. Not truly. All we can create are shadows, specters, illusions. But not life." "Then how did you come to terms?" Eilis asked, her voice heavy with longing. "I did not come to terms," Morgana replied with a slight smile. "I accepted. These are different things. To come to terms means to surrender. To accept means to understand that death is part of life, and that the love we felt does not disappear with death. It remains in our hearts, in our memories, in how we live after loss. But memories are not enough for me," Eilis whispered. "I want to hear his voice, see his smile, talk with him." "I understand," Morgana nodded. "And you know what? That is normal. That is human. We are not made to forget those we love. But there is a difference between preserving the memory of them and trying to bring them back against the will of death." She paused, gazing at the fire, then continued. "There is an old wisdom, passed to me by my teacher. She said, 'True love does not hold. True love lets go.' But letting go does not mean forgetting. It means allowing the deceased person to rest, whilst keeping them in one's heart." "How can I keep him in my heart when it is tearing apart with pain?" Eilis asked, and tears filled her eyes again. Morgana rose and approached her. She placed a hand on Eilis's shoulder, and in that touch was so much warmth and understanding that something within Eilis began to thaw. "Pain means the love was true," Morgana said quietly, "and with time, the pain will become less, whilst the love will remain. Memories will stop hurting and begin to warm, but it takes time, and it takes allowing yourself to live on." Eilis wept, and Morgana simply stood nearby, allowing her to cry it out. When the tears finally ran dry, the older witch sat again. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "there is one way to preserve a person not in dark magic, but in light. Through art, through creativity. Artists have long attempted to capture the essence of a person on canvas, poets, in words, musicians, in melodies. What if this were combined with magic? Not dark magic that violates balance, but preservation magic, which you know so well." Eilis lifted her head, her eyes widening. "Preservation magic?" "Yes. You are a mistress of knowledge preservation charms. What if you applied these same principles not to knowledge, but to personality? Created something that would preserve not the body, not the spirit, but the very echo of a person. Their mannerisms, their phrases, their character. It was so simple, and yet so complex." Eilis silently looked at Morgana, thoughts whirling in her head, forming new patterns. "But how?" she finally asked. "That you will have to discover for yourself," Morgana replied, standing. "I can only point the direction. The path you must walk yourself. But remember, seek in light, not in darkness. Seek in love, not in fear. And seek a way to preserve, not to resurrect." She walked to the door, but on the threshold turned. "One more thing. If you find this path, you will create something that will help not only you. Many people suffer from loss. Many need a way to preserve the memory of those they loved. Perhaps your pain will become a gift for others. And with these words Morgana left, leaving Eilis alone with her thoughts. Eilis sat motionless for a long time, staring at the fire. Morgana's words echoed in her head, intertwining with her own thoughts. Not resurrect, but preserve. Not dark magic, but light. Not violation of balance, but working with it. She rose and approached the table where lay Kaelin's unfinished drawing. She lifted it, peering at the features of the face he had drawn. Her face. He had wanted to preserve her image. And what if one could do more? What if the drawing could preserve not only the image, but the personality as well? What if the portrait could speak, move, be something more than merely paint on canvas? It would not be resurrection, it would not be return to life, but it would be preservation. An echo, a memory that lives and breathes. Eilis set aside the drawing and took clean parchment. Her wand lay nearby, and she took it, feeling the familiar warmth. This magic was her magic. Magic of preservation, transmission, fixation. Magic of light. If she could not bring Kaelin back, she would create a way to preserve him. Not a specter, not an illusion, but something true, something that would be an echo of his soul, created by love, memories, and the magic of light. She began to write, and this time the words flowed easily, naturally. Not dark rituals, but light spells. Not blood and pain, but love and memory. Not violation of the natural order, but creation of something new within that order. Outside the window, the moon shone again over the lake, but now, Eilis did not feel that terrible emptiness that had oppressed her for months. In its place, appeared something else. Not hope, not yet hope, but direction, purpose. Light at the end of a dark tunnel. She knew the path would be long, knew that not everything would succeed at once. But she was ready. Ready to create something new, something the world had not yet seen. And if she succeeded, she would not only preserve Kaelin, she would give others the opportunity to preserve those they loved. The opportunity to speak with the past, to learn from the dead, to preserve the wisdom of generations. This was more than merely a selfish desire to bring back a beloved. This was a calling. And Eilis Cormyran accepted it. The candles burned until dawn, and she wrote, filling page after page with new ideas. The darkness receded, and with it receded despair. What remained was something harder, but also brighter. Work. Purpose. Love transforming into creation. And for the first time in many months, Eilis smiled. Spring came to the highlands timidly, as though afraid to frighten away winter. Snow melted slowly, revealing dark earth, and the first flowers pushed through fallen leaves with such persistence that Eilis could not help but admire their vitality. She stood by the lake, watching the ice break at the edges, watching the water begin to flow again, and thought that spring was always about rebirth. But her own rebirth took a different form. Eilis's work table was now cluttered, not only with books and parchments, but with new tools. Brushes of various sizes, from the finest that could draw a line, the width of a hair, to broad ones for large strokes. Paints, not ordinary but magical, which she herself created, mixing pigments with extracts of rare plants, and drops of enchanted water from the spring by the ancient oak. Canvases, stretched on wooden frames, awaited the touch of the brush. Eilis had never considered herself an artist. Kaelin had been the one with talent for drawing. But now, she had to learn. She began with simple things, painted flowers, trees, birds. Her first attempts were clumsy, the lines angular, the colors imprecise. But she learned. Day after day, week after week, her hand grew more confident. When she felt ready, she began her first experiment. The first canvas was small, the size of a book. Eilis decided to paint a simple flower, a pale rose that grew by their house. She sat before the easel, holding a brush in one hand and her wand in the other. Her heart beat rapidly with excitement and fear. She began to paint, slowly, carefully applying paint to the canvas. Stem, leaves, petals. When the physical image was complete, it was time for magic. Eilis raised her wand and quietly spoke the first spell she had created for this Memoria Pictura. The spell of image preservation. The wand glowed faintly with warm golden light, and this light flowed onto the canvas, enveloping the rose's image in a shimmering aura. Nothing happened. Eilis frowned. She tried another spell, Anima Depicta, the spell of image animation. Again, a flash of light. Again, silence. She continued trying for hours, using different combinations of charms, changing formulations, experimenting with the intensity of magical energy. Finally, when the sun was already slanting towards the horizon, something happened. The rose's petals on the canvas trembled. Eilis froze, afraid even to breathe. The rose was moving, barely, almost imperceptibly, but moving. The petals quivered in an unfelt breeze, the stem swayed gently. "Yes," Eilis whispered, feeling joy fill her chest. This was only the beginning, she understood. The rose moved, but it was simple automatic movement, without consciousness, without purpose. But it was progress. The first step on a long road. The following weeks Eilis devoted to perfecting the technique. She painted various objects, attempting to animate them. A bird that flapped its wings. A butterfly that trembled on a flower. Fire in the hearth that danced on canvas, just as real fire did. Each experiment yielded new knowledge. She understood that magic had to be woven into the painting process from the very beginning. It was not enough to cast charms on a finished drawing. Magic had to become part of the paint itself, the canvas itself, every stroke of the brush. Eilis began creating new paints, adding to them not only magical ingredients, but her own magical energy. She held her wand over bowls of pigments and whispered saturation spells, allowing her magic to permeate the materials. The paints began to glow, to pulse with a barely visible inner light. When she painted with these paints, the images became more alive. The bird did not merely flap its wings, it sang. Quietly, indistinctly, but it sang. The fire did not merely dance, it crackled, radiated warmth that could be felt by bringing one's hand near the canvas. But this was still not enough. These were simple imitations of life, devoid of true consciousness. Eilis needed more, she needed personality. And finally the day came when she felt ready to try painting a person. Eilis chose a small canvas for her first attempt. She decided not to begin immediately with Kaelin. That would be too painful if she failed. Instead, she painted Adrian, the older witch from the settlement, who had always been kind to her. She worked slowly, carefully, rendering every detail of the face, the wrinkles around the eyes, the soft lines of the lips, the grey hair falling to the shoulders. Whilst painting, she recalled Adrian, her voice, her smile, her kindness, and she spoke these memories aloud, allowing them to weave into the paint. Adrian always smiles when she sees children, Eilis said, working on the lines around the mouth. Her voice is calm, like the flow of water in a stream. She loves the scent of lavender and always keeps a bunch of it in her home. When the portrait was complete, Eilis set down her brush and took her wand in both hands. She closed her eyes, concentrated, and began speaking a new spell, Vita Depicta, the spell of living image, but this time she put into it more than merely words. She put her memories of Adrian, her emotions, her understanding of this person. Magic flowed from her wand in a thick stream of golden light that enveloped the portrait, seeped into the paint, into the canvas, into the very structure of the image. The room filled with a quiet hum, like distant singing, and the air became thick, saturated with magic. When the light faded, Eilis opened her eyes. Adrian's portrait looked at her, not with dead painted eyes, but with living ones that blinked. Her chest rose and fell, as though the portrait breathed. Her lips smiled slightly. "This is," Eilis whispered, "this is working." But when she approached for a closer look, she saw that something was wrong. Adrian's eyes looked, but there was no depth in them. The smile was mechanical, devoid of true warmth. And when Eilis tried to speak to the portrait, it did not respond, only stared with an empty gaze. This was movement, but not life. Form, but not essence. Eilis lowered her head, feeling disappointment settle like a heavy stone in her chest. She had been so close. So close. But something was still wrong. The following attempts yielded similar results. Eilis painted various people from the settlement, people she knew. Each portrait came alive, moved, breathed, sometimes even made sounds. But none had true consciousness. They were dolls, beautiful and complex, but empty inside. One evening, as Eilis sat amongst her failed portraits, feeling exhausted and disappointed, Morgana came to her again. The old witch surveyed the room, her gaze sliding over the portraits frozen in eternal incomplete life. "You have achieved much," she said, "but something is still missing." "I know," Eilis replied wearily. "But I do not understand what exactly. I have put in magic, I have put in memories, I have painted them as accurately as possible. Why are they still empty?" Morgana approached one of the portraits, the image of a young man from the settlement. "You have put in memories," she said thoughtfully, "but have you put in emotions? True, deep emotions that connected you with these people?" Eilis pondered. "I do not understand. Memories are facts," Morgana explained. "You remember how this person looked, what they said, how they moved. But the portrait needs more. It needs emotional connection. The feelings you experienced when you were with this person, love, joy, even sadness. Without emotions there is no life." "But how do I put emotions into the portrait?" "Not into the portrait," Morgana corrected. "Into the process of creation. Each stroke of the brush must carry not only color but feeling. Each spell must be filled not only with magic, but with love. You cannot create a living portrait of a person you do not know deeply, whom you do not love sincerely." Eilis was silent, digesting these words, and suddenly understood. That was why her portraits were empty. She painted people she knew, but did not love as deeply as was needed. Their portraits could not be truly alive, because her connection with them was superficial. "I must paint him," she whispered. "Kaelin, I must paint him." Morgana nodded. "Only then will you be able to put in enough to create a true echo of the soul." Eilis prepared for a week. She created new paints, the most perfect of all she had made thus far. Mixed pigments with extracts of plants Kaelin had loved, with water from their lake, with drops of her own blood, not for dark magic, but as a symbol of the connection that united them. Every drop of magical energy she poured into the paints was accompanied by a memory, an emotion, a feeling of love. She chose the largest canvas she had, set it by the window, where the light was best, and one morning, when the sun had only just risen over the lake, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, she began. The first stroke was the hardest. Her hand trembled, her heart hammered, tears veiled her eyes. But she forced herself to continue. She outlined the shape of the face, the shoulders, began rendering the details, and whilst painting she spoke with Kaelin, to Kaelin, about Kaelin. "Do you remember how we first met?" she whispered, drawing the line of his cheek. "It was at the fair in the settlement. You were selling your herbal infusions, and I was searching for ingredients for spells. You smiled at me, and I felt something in my heart tremble. Stroke after stroke, word after word, memory after memory. She painted his eyes, warm, brown, that always looked at her with such tenderness. His lips, which kissed her forehead when she fell asleep. His hands, strong but gentle, that could both gather the tiniest flower and embrace her so tightly, it seemed nothing could part them. You taught me to see beauty in simple things," she continued, "in a dewdrop on a leaf, in a bird's song at dawn, in the shape of clouds in the sky. You said that magic is everywhere, one need only know how to look." Day flowed into evening, evening into night. Eilis worked by candlelight, not stopping. Her body ached, her eyes burned with fatigue, but she could not stop. This was more than merely painting. This was creation, resurrection not of the body, but of memory, not of life, but of love. "When you fell ill, I prayed to all the gods I knew," she whispered through tears, rendering the final details. "I begged death to take me instead of you. But death does not listen to pleas, it takes when its time comes." Finally, when the first ray of dawn penetrated the window, the portrait was complete. Eilis set down her brush and stepped back, gazing at her creation. Kaelin looked at her from the canvas, so alive, so real, that she nearly reached out to touch him. But this was not yet the end. The physical image was ready, but it needed the final step. Eilis raised her wand, closed her eyes, took a deep breath, gathering all her magic, all her love, all her pain into one point within herself, and began speaking the spell. But this was not merely a spell. This was a prayer, this was confession, this was farewell and meeting at once. Memoriam vivificae, she spoke, and each word resonated, filled with power. Animam depictum suscitare, ex amore meo, ex memoria mea, ex dolore meo, vive, not as living but as echo, not as body but as soul, vive amor meus vive, revive memory, awaken the painted soul, from my love, from my memory, from my pain, live, live my love, live. Magic exploded from her wand in a torrent of light, not golden as before, but white, blinding, pure. It flooded the room, enveloped the portrait, penetrated every molecule of paint, every thread of canvas. Eilis felt something tear from her chest, a part of herself, of her love, of her memory of Kaelan, and flow into the portrait. The light became so bright that she was forced to close her eyes. The air hummed, vibrated with the power of magic. It lasted an eternity, and yet a moment. And then came silence. Eilis slowly opened her eyes. The room was ordinary. The candles guttered low. Dawn light poured through the window, and the portrait breathed. Saylan's chest on the canvas rose and fell smoothly, naturally. His eyes, those same brown, warm eyes, blinked. His lips parted slightly, and he inhaled, as though for the first time. Then his gaze focused on Eilis. Eilis, he spoke, and his voice, was exactly as she remembered, slightly hoarse, warm, with a light smile in the intonation. Eilis stepped back, pressing her hand to her mouth. Tears rolled down her cheeks. She could not believe it. Could not. Kaelan, she whispered. The portrait smiled. A true smile, the very one she had loved so much. My enchanting Eilis, he said softly. Why do you weep? These should have been phrases she had embedded in the portrait. Memories she had spoken whilst painting. But something in the tone, in the intonation, was different. More alive. Eilis approached, looking into his eyes. There was depth in them, understanding, something that went beyond simple reflection. Is this working? She whispered. It appears so, Kaelan replied, looking around. Though I feel strange, light, as though a dream. His eyes found hers again. But you are here, and that is what matters most. Eilis laughed through tears, unable to contain her emotions. She had done it. She had truly done it. Created something impossible, something the world had not yet seen. A living portrait. Not merely a moving image, but a true echo of personality, capable of speaking, thinking, being. Kaelan, she said, I have missed you so much. I know, he replied quietly. I feel it, your love, your pain, they are part of me now. You created me from them. They spoke for a long time, whilst the sun rose higher in the sky. Eilis told him everything that had happened in 3 years, and he listened, smiled, sometimes asked questions. And though she knew this was not the real Kaelan, not her husband returned from beyond death's veil, it was enough. This was an echo of his soul, created by her love. And for the first time in 3 years, Eilis felt she could breathe freely. The following days she spent hours by the portrait, speaking with Kaelan, growing accustomed to this marvelous creation. He was not perfect. Sometimes his answers were simple, based on memories she had embedded. He could not speak of things she herself did not know. But there were moments. There were moments when he said something unexpected. One evening, as Eilis sat by the hearth reading a book, Kaelan's portrait suddenly spoke. You know that I am proud of you. Eilis lifted her head, surprised. What? I am proud of you, he repeated, for what you have done, for not surrendering, for finding the path through darkness to light. Eilis froze. She had never spoken these words whilst painting, had never embedded this memory, because it did not exist. Saylan could not be proud of her for what she had done after his death. He had not known of it, but the portrait knew, or there truly was a part of genuine consciousness in him, something more than merely memories. something that had arisen from love, from magic, from that mysterious process she had created. "Kalen," she whispered, are you real?" He smiled, a little sadly, a little wisely. "I am as real as I can be," he replied. "I am your memories of me, your love for me, your understanding of who I was, and something else, something neither you nor I can fully understand. An echo, perhaps, an echo of what remains when someone loves as strongly as you loved me." Tears filled Eilis's eyes again, but this time they were not from pain, but from wonder. She had created something more than she had hoped, something that bordered on miracle. And she knew this was only the beginning of something that would change the world. The weeks that passed after the portrait's creation were the strangest in Eilis's life. She awoke each morning and first looked at the portrait hanging on the wall of her workroom. And each time Kalen smiled back at her, greeting the new day. "Good morning, my enchanting one," he would say, and his voice filled the room with warmth. "Did you not sleep all night again?" "How do you know?" Eilis asked, approaching closer. "The shadows beneath your eyes, and the way you move? Slower than usual. You always did so when you were tired." Eilis smiled. He truly knew her. Or at least, the echo of Kalen that lived in the portrait knew her as well as the real Kalen had. They spoke for hours. At first, Eilis feared the conversations would be limited, repetitive, but with each day the portrait seemed ever more alive, ever more capable of complex discussions. Kalen jested. His humor was the same as she remembered. He gave advice, wise, measured, exactly such as the real Kalen would have given. He even argued with her when he thought she was wrong. "You are too hard on yourself," he said once, when Eilis complained of her inability to paint perfectly. "You have created magic the world has not yet seen. That is worth more than any perfect image." "But if I could paint better, the portrait would be more perfect," Eilis objected. "Perfection is an illusion," Kalen replied with a slight smile. "Beauty lies in imperfection. Do you remember what I said about flowers? The most beautiful of them are those that have small deviations from the ideal. That is what makes them unique." Eilis fell silent, looking at him. Yes, he had said this. Many years ago, when they walked through the forest, and he showed her a wild orchid with a slightly bent petal. "You remember this," she whispered. "I remember everything you remember," he replied quietly. "I am created from your memories, Eilis. Every word I say, every thought that arises, all of it comes from what you put into me. And yet," he paused, looking somewhere beyond the frame, as though seeing something Eilis could not see. "And yet?" she prompted. "And yet, I feel that I am something more," he continued slowly. "As though your love created not merely a copy of memories, but something new. Something that can think independently, within the bounds of who I was. It is a strange feeling. I know I am not alive, but I feel real, blank." One evening when rain was beginning outside, Eilis finally gathered courage to ask the question that had troubled her from the very beginning. "Kalen," she said, sitting in the chair by the hearth, "do you understand what happened? That you are a portrait?" He was silent for a long time, and Eilis almost regretted asking, but then he spoke, and in his voice was such depth of understanding that she froze. "Yes," he replied. "I know that I am not that Kalen who lived and breathed. I have no body. I do not feel wind on my face, cannot touch you, cannot step beyond this frame. I am an echo, a shadow of who he was, created from your love and your memory." Does it hurt you to realize this?" Eilis asked, feeling her throat constrict with emotion. "Can it hurt to realize what you are?" he answered with a question. "I exist. That is already a miracle. I can think, speak, feel, at least what a portrait can feel. I see you, hear you, can bring you comfort. That is more than non-existence." "But you cannot live," Eilis whispered. "Not truly." "And what is true life?" Kalen asked, tilting his head. "Is life merely heartbeat and breath? Or is it consciousness, thought, the ability to feel and be? Philosophers have argued about this for centuries. Perhaps I do not live in the ordinary sense, but I am. And whilst you remember me, whilst you come to speak with me, I am real." Eilis was silent, digesting his words. Rain drummed against the windows, fire crackled in the hearth, and she looked at her beloved's portrait, and tried to understand the boundary between life and death, between reality and echo. "I created you not to replace the real Kalen," she said finally. "I understand that now. He is gone, his soul has found peace, and I have no right to disturb it. But I created a part of him, that which can remain when someone has gone, a way to preserve the wisdom, personality, essence of a person for those who remain." "Exactly so," Kalen nodded. "And you know what? I think the real Kalen would be proud of you, for what you have done, for finding a way to transform pain into creation, loss into gift." Tears rolled down Alice's cheeks, but she smiled. Would he truly be proud? Or do I simply wish to believe it? "Does it matter?" the portrait asked gently. "Belief is also a form of truth. If you believe he would be proud of you, then he is proud. In your heart, in your memory, in me. Is that not enough?" For the first time in many months, Eilis felt true peace. Not happiness, not yet happiness, but acceptance, understanding. She had not brought Kalen back, but had created something that allowed her not to lose him completely. And perhaps that was how it should be. Summer blossomed over the highlands, transforming the slopes into carpets of flowers. Eilis began leaving the house more often, visiting the settlement, speaking with people. Kalen's portrait encouraged her to do so. "You cannot live only on conversations with me," he said. "I am part of your memory, but life continues. Go, meet with friends, work, create something new. I shall always be here when you return." And she listened. Slowly, carefully, she began to live again. Not as before, that life had died with Kalen, but anew, differently. One day at the market, Adrian approached her. The older witch looked at Eilis attentively, peering into her face, and suddenly smiled. "Something has changed," she said. "You look different, lighter." "I found a way," Eilis replied simply, "a way to preserve what I thought I had lost forever." "A way?" Adrian leaned closer, intrigued. Eilis hesitated. She had not yet told anyone about the portrait. It was her secret, her personal miracle. But something in Adrian's warm gaze prompted her to speak. "You will not believe it, but I created a living portrait of Kalen. He can speak, think, be almost as he was." Adrian froze, her eyes widening. "A living portrait? You mean?" "Not necromancy," Eilis quickly objected. "Nothing dark, simply preservation magic, combined with art, with love, with memories. It is difficult to explain. But it works." The older witch was silent for a long time, digesting what she had heard. Then she asked quietly, "May I see him?" That evening, Adrian came to Eilis's dwelling. They walked to the workroom, where Kalen's portrait hung on the wall. He smiled, seeing the guest. "Adrian," he greeted. "How long it has been since we saw each other." "Do you still grow lavender in your garden?" Adrian gasped, pressing her hand to her mouth. Tears filled her eyes. "Kalen, is this truly you, in a certain sense?" He replied gently. "I am what Eilis remembers of me, an echo, if you will. But I am here." Adrian approached closer, peering at the portrait. Her hand reached out, as though wanting to touch, but stopped an inch from the canvas. "This is incredible," she whispered. "Eilis, do you understand what you have created? This will change everything." "What do you mean?" Adrian turned to her, and in her eyes burned the fire of excitement. "So many people lose loved ones. So many people suffer from being unable to hear their voice any longer, see their smile, receive their advice. And you have found a way to preserve this. Not to resurrect the dead, that is impossible and wrong, but to preserve their essence, their personality. This is a gift, Eilis, an enormous gift." Eilis had not thought of it in such light. She had created Kalen's portrait for herself, from her personal need. But Adrian was right. If this magic worked for her, it could work for others as well. "But it is difficult," Eilis said. "One must know how to paint, understand preservation magic, feel deep emotional connection with the person. You can teach, Adrian insisted. At least try. Think of all those whom this could help. Eilis looked at Kaelin's portrait. He smiled. Not at her, but simply into space, as though rejoicing that his existence could bring something good into the world. What do you think? She asked him. I think Adrian is right, Kaelin replied. You have created something beautiful, why not share it with others? The real Kaelin always believed that knowledge should be accessible. Why should magic be different? Eilis slowly nodded. It was frightening. To share this meant to open her soul, to show her vulnerability, her pain. But perhaps that was where the strength lay. Very well, she said finally. I shall try. Word spread quickly. In such a small settlement, secrets did not keep long. Within a week, people began coming to Eilis, at first singly, then in pairs, in groups. All wanted to see the miracle. A living portrait that could speak and think. Among the first was a young woman named Eleanor, who had lost her mother a year ago. She stood in the doorway of Eilis's dwelling, clutching an old shawl in her hands, and tears streamed down her face. Please, she pleaded. If you truly can create such a portrait, I am ready to pay everything I have. Simply give me the opportunity to hear her voice once more. Eilis let her inside and showed her Kaelin's portrait. Eleanor stood, gazing at him with reverence, whilst Kaelin told her of the weather and the flowers blooming by the lake. When she left, hope burned in her eyes. Next came old wizard Brennan, who had lost his son in battle with a dark wizard. Then, a couple who longed to preserve the image of their daughter who had died as an infant. Then, another, and another person. Each story was filled with pain. Each person carried their loss, their longing, and all of them looked at Eilis with hope that bordered on despair. One evening, when yet another visitor had left, Eilis sat with her head in her hands, feeling overwhelmed by others' emotions. There are so many of them, she whispered. Kaelin, there are so many, I cannot help everyone. You are not obliged to help everyone, the portrait replied gently. You are not even obliged to help anyone. This is your magic, your discovery. You decide what to do with it. But they suffer. How can I refuse? You cannot take upon yourself the pain of the entire world, Kaelin said. But you can teach others. You can pass on the knowledge to those who have talent and desire. Create not one portrait, but hundreds, through the hands of other masters. You need not do everything yourself. Eilis lifted her head, looking at him. Of course, he was right. She could not create a portrait for every person who had lost someone. But she could teach others this art, create a tradition, a school, a way that would exist for centuries after her. The next morning, Eilis came out to the settlement's market square. People gathered around her, whispering, waiting. She raised her hand, calling for silence. I have heard your requests, she said loudly, so all could hear. I see your pain. And I wish to help. But I cannot create a portrait for each of you that would take an entire lifetime, and more. Disappointment ran through the crowd like a wave, but Eilis continued. Instead, I offer something else. I shall teach you, those who have talent for painting or preservation magic, those who are ready to learn, to work, to dedicate time to mastering this art. I shall pass on my knowledge, and you will be able to create portraits yourselves, for others, for preserving the memory of those we love. Silence. Then someone asked, how long will it take, the learning? Months, Eilis answered honestly, perhaps years. This is complex magic, requiring not only technical mastery, but deep understanding of the nature of memory and love. But I promise, if you are ready to learn, I am ready to teach. Silence again. Then the young woman, Eleanor, stepped forward. I wish to learn, she said resolutely. If it will help me create a portrait of my mother, I am ready to dedicate as much time as necessary. I as well, said old Brennan. And I, another woman joined. One by one people stepped forward, not all, some turned away, disappointed that there would be no quick solution, but many remained, enough to begin. Eilis looked at them and felt something heavy that had pressed on her chest for months finally release. She was not alone. Her pain was not unique. And what she had created from that pain could now become something greater. Not merely personal salvation, but a gift for the world. That evening, when Eilis returned home, Kaelin's portrait smiled at her with special warmth. "I saw," he said, "through the window, through how your gaze changed. You made the right choice." "I hope so," Eilis replied, sitting in her favorite chair. "I am afraid, Kaelin. What if I cannot teach them? What if they create something wrong, something dangerous?" "Then you will correct them," he said simply. "You are not the only one who will do this. Students will learn from each other, correct mistakes, perfect the technique. That is how all great things are created. Not by one person, but by generations of masters." Eilis fell silent, gazing at the fire in the hearth. Then she asked quietly, "Are you happy? In the sense that a portrait can be happy?" Kaelin pondered, and on his face appeared genuine thoughtfulness. "I do not know if this can be called happiness," he replied finally. "But I feel satisfaction, purpose. I exist not merely as a memory, but as something that has meaning. I see how you grow, how you change, how you create something beautiful. And if a portrait can feel pride, then I feel it." Tears filled Eilis's eyes again, but this time, they were warm, bright. "I love you," she whispered. "I do not know if one can love a portrait, but I love you." "And I love you," Kaelin replied, "as much as an echo can love, and perhaps even more. Because this love is the only thing that makes me real." They sat in silence for a long time, listening to the rain begin again outside, to the wind rustling the leaves of trees by the lake. And for the first time in many years, Eilis felt she had found what she had been searching for. Not return of the past, not resurrection of the dead, but something else. A way to make love not die with the body. To make memory alive, breathing, capable of speaking and comforting. The echo of the soul. And that was enough. More than enough. The 1100s, the beginning. Eilis Cormyran's first students worked tirelessly. Eleanor proved the most talented. Her hands were skilled, and her heart open enough to pour true love into the portrait. The first portrait she created independently was of her mother, and when the image finally spoke, Eleanor wept, so that she could not stop for hours. "My daughter," said her mother's portrait in a gentle voice, "do not weep. I am here. I shall always be here whilst you remember me." Eilis watched this with quiet pride. Her discovery worked. Not only for her, but for others as well. She recorded everything. Each step of the process, each spell, each nuance of technique, in thick manuscripts that were to become the foundation of the new art. Over 15 years, she taught 24 students. Some of them continued teaching others, spreading the knowledge further. The art of creating living portraits began traveling through the magical world. First across Britain, then to the continent. When Eilis was 60 years old, a messenger came to her from the King of Scotland, a wizard who ruled in the shadow of the Muggle monarch. He asked her to create a portrait of the late Queen, so that her wisdom could advise future generations. Eilis accepted this commission, and when the Queen's portrait spoke, giving counsel on ruling the kingdom, the magical nobility understood the true value of this art. It was not merely a way to comfort the grieving, this was a way to preserve wisdom, knowledge, the experience of generations. The 1200s, spread among the nobility. Lord Gwydion's castle in Wales was the first where an entire gallery of living portraits adorned the walls. The Lord's ancestors gazed from canvases, conversed amongst themselves, gave advice to the current master. Visitors froze in reverence, passing through these corridors where the past met the present. "This changes everything," said one of the guests, a magical lord from Northumbria. "Now our descendants will be able to learn of us, not from cold chronicles, but from living conversations." Portraits became symbols of status. Wealthy magical families competed for the best portrait masters. Specialized schools appeared, where this art was taught. Techniques improved, portraits became ever more realistic, ever more capable of complex thought, but not all approved of this practice. "This is unnatural," said some old wizards. "We have no right to hold the dead in this world, even in the form of portraits." "This is not holding," others replied. "This is preservation. We do not forbid souls to go onward. We merely create echoes of those who have gone, for those who remain." Debates continued for decades, but the practice did not cease. Too many people found comfort in conversations with portraits of their loved ones. Too much wisdom was preserved in these enchanted canvases. The 1400s, the Hogwarts tradition. When Hogwarts was founded by 4 great wizards, they quickly understood the value of living portraits for the school. Godric Gryffindor was the first to commission a portrait for himself, whilst still living. "When I am gone," he told the artist who painted him, "someone must advise future generations about the principles upon which this school is founded." After the founders' deaths, their portraits occupied places of honor in the castle. With time, portraits of headmasters, distinguished professors, heroes of the magical world were added to them. But the most important tradition was established in the headmaster's office. Each new leader of the school commissioned their portrait whilst still living, then visited it for years, teaching, embedding knowledge, memories, wisdom. When the headmaster died, their portrait became an advisor to the successor. This created unique continuity of knowledge. The current headmaster could consult with dozens of predecessors who had seen centuries of the school's history, knew all its secrets, remembered all its traditions. The first headmistress to fully utilize this system recorded in her diary, "Conversation with Godric Gryffindor's portrait is like conversation with history itself. He remembers why every stone in this castle lies exactly where it does. Without these portraits, Hogwarts would lose part of its soul." Students quickly grew accustomed to living portraits on the walls. The fat lady guarding the entrance to Gryffindor Tower became a favorite, though her constant demand for passwords sometimes irritated. Sir Cadogan did his best to valiantly offer assistance to students when he could. Portraits became part of the castle's life, its spirit, its memory. The 1700s, perfection of the art. A wizard named Aristide Lucier from France revolutionized the technique of creating portraits. He discovered that using certain magical pigments extracted from rare plants allowed portraits to have more complex consciousness. His portraits could sustain deeper philosophical conversations, remember more details, even express emotions more complexly. "The secret is not in the spells," he wrote in his treatise, "but in the materials. Each paint has its magical resonance. The right combination creates a portrait that can almost think independently." His methods spread across Europe. In Vienna, the Academy of Portrait Art opened, where they taught not only technical skills, but the philosophy of preserving personality. "A portrait is not a copy," one of the professors taught. "It is an interpretation. The artist must see not only appearance, but the soul of the person, must understand what makes them unique. Only then will the portrait be truly alive." The most talented masters of this era created portraits that could tell stories unknown even to the artist. The portrait of the great alchemist Nicolas Flamel, created at the end of his life, contained so much knowledge about the philosopher's stone that future generations of alchemists studied it for centuries. The 1900s, democratization of the art. By the beginning of the 20th century, portrait creation ceased to be the privilege of nobility alone. Ordinary magical families also began commissioning portraits of their loved ones. Small portraits that could fit on a mantelpiece or dresser became common in many homes. A grandmother could watch from her portrait over her grandchildren, tell them stories, give advice. A grandfather could jest from his portrait, maintain family traditions. Even children who died young could leave their portrait, so parents had the opportunity to speak with them, keep their memory alive. This changed magical society's understanding of death. It remained an ending, remained a loss, but not complete destruction. Something could remain. Not the body, not the soul. They went onward, to those mysterious places where the living cannot go. But an echo. A memory that lives and breathes. Love that does not fade. But problems arose as well. Some people became too dependent on portraits, spending hours conversing with the dead, instead of living their own lives. Magical psychologists began warning of the danger of excessive attachment to portraits. "A portrait is a tool of memory," wrote a famous healer, "but not a replacement for life. We must remember the dead but not live in the past." The 1990s, the time of Harry Potter. In St. Mungo's Hospital for Magical Maladies and Injuries, on the second floor, hung an entire gallery of portraits of distinguished healers of the past. Among them was the portrait of Dilys Derwent, who served as both healer and headmistress of Hogwarts. Her portrait could move between the hospital and the school, transmitting messages, advising both institutions. In the Ministry of Magic, corridors were lined with portraits of former ministers. Some of them slept most of the time, others watched events attentively, sometimes even commenting on current officials' decisions. "Young Scrimgeour is making the right decisions," noted one old minister's portrait. "Reminds me of myself at his age." At Hogwarts, Harry Potter turned to portraits for advice numerous times. Most important was his conversation with Dumbledore's portrait after the battle. Though Minerva McGonagall warned that portraits were only echoes, not complete copies of personality, Harry found comfort in the words spoken by the painted Dumbledore. "You did what needed to be done," Dumbledore's portrait said, "and I, if a portrait can feel such things, am prouder of you than words can express." But most marvelous was the moment when Harry realized the true value of these portraits. Not as replacements for living people, but as bridges between generations, as ways of transmitting wisdom, as memory that does not fade. The 2020s, the present day. Emma Brockway stood in her small workshop in Diagon Alley, gazing at the canvas before her. She was 27 years old, and this was her first independent portrait. Not a commission from a wealthy client. Not educational work under the supervision of a professor from the Academy of Magical Arts. This was a portrait of her grandfather, who had died last month. Grandfather Albert had been an Auror, a hero of the war against Voldemort, though he always modestly kept silent about his exploits. Emma had grown up on his stories, his jokes, his wise advice, and now he was gone. But she could create something that would preserve his memory. Emma had spent weeks preparing, created paints according to the ancient recipe she had learned at the Academy, the very same that originated from Eilis Cormyran, founder of this art over 900 years ago. She meditated, gathered memories, prepared her heart for this act of creation. Now the time had come. She lifted her brush and began to paint. Grandfather's face formed stroke by stroke, the wrinkles around his eyes that appeared when he smiled, the grey beard, always neatly trimmed, the scar on his left cheek, a memory of a battle he never fully recounted. Whilst painting, Emma spoke, as her teachers had taught her. As Eilis had taught her first students centuries ago. "I remember, grandfather, how you taught me my first spell," she whispered. "I was 5 years old, and I was so proud when the feather flew. You said that magic is not about power, but about understanding, about feeling the world around you." Hours flowed into hours. Sunlight changed to moonlight. Emma worked without stopping, immersed in memories, in love, in that special state when the boundary between artist and creation blurs. Finally, the portrait was complete. Emma stepped back, wiping tears from her face. Grandfather looked at her from the canvas, so alive, so real. She raised her wand, took a deep breath, and began speaking the awakening spell. The words flowed naturally, though she had studied them for months. Memoriam vivificare. Animam depictam suscitare. Ancient words, passed through centuries, from Eilis to her students, from them to their students, down the endless chain of generations, all the way to Emma. Magic flared, enveloped the portrait in white radiance. The air trembled with power, and when the light faded, grandfather blinked. His chest rose, as though he inhaled. His gaze focused on Emma, and his face showed the familiar warm smile. "Little Emma," he said, and his voice was exactly as she remembered. "You did it. I knew you could." Emma laughed through tears, pressing her hands to her chest. "Grandfather, you are here. In a certain sense," he replied with a slight smile, "though I feel somewhat flat, literally." She laughed. This was his humor, his style. The portrait worked. Not merely moved or spoke memorized phrases. It was alive, in that special form, allowed by Eilis Cormyran's magic. Later that evening, as Emma walked the streets of Diagon Alley, carrying her grandfather's portrait home, she passed an old gallery of magical art. Something made her stop and peer into the window. Inside, illuminated by the soft light of candles, hung an exhibition of Britain's most ancient magical portraits. And among them, in the center, was one special portrait. A middle-aged woman with long chestnut hair and wise brown eyes gazed from the canvas. The plaque below read, Eilis Cormyran, approximately 1066 to 1148, founder of the art of living portraits. Emma froze. She knew of Eilis, of course. Every student at the academy studied her life, her discovery. But to see her portrait, this was something else. And then, Eilis moved. Her gaze met Emma's through the gallery window. A smile appeared on her face. Quiet, understanding, filled with pride. She nodded slightly, as though greeting Emma, approving her work. Emma felt something warm spread through her chest. Eilis saw. Through centuries, through countless generations of artists, through millions of portraits created by her method. She saw, and was proud. Emma nodded in response, clutching her grandfather's portrait tighter. Then she turned and walked home, feeling history embrace her, feeling the past support the present. Reflections through time. Magical society had changed incredibly over the 9 centuries that had passed since Eilis Cormyran's time. But some things remained unchanged. Love, loss, the need to remember those who had gone. Living portraits became bridges between these things. They did not replace the dead. That would be wrong, unnatural. But they preserved something important. Wisdom, personality, the essence of what made a person who they were. At Hogwarts, headmasters consulted with their predecessors, learned from their mistakes, continued their traditions. In the ministry, history lived on the walls, warning of past errors. In St. Mungo's Hospital, the best healers of the past continued teaching new generations. And in homes, throughout Britain, throughout the magical world, ordinary families could speak with their grandmothers and grandfathers, parents and children who had gone too soon. Could hear their stories, laugh at their jokes, receive their love. This changed the understanding of death. It remained an ending, remained a loss. But not complete destruction. Something could remain, not the body, not the soul. They went onward, to those mysterious places where the living cannot go, but an echo. A memory that lives and breathes. Love that does not fade, the final thoughts of Eilis. In her final gallery, in her own portrait hanging in Britain's oldest gallery, Eilis Cormyran watched the world she had changed. She saw generation after generation of artists perfecting her technique, saw how her discovery spread far beyond what she could have imagined. Saw the joy of people who found comfort in conversations with portraits of loved ones, and she smiled. When she created the first portrait of Caelan, 9 centuries ago, she did so from despair, from pain, from inability to let go. But what she created proved greater than her personal loss. It became a gift for the world. Her portrait could not leave the gallery. It was too old, too precious. But it could see through the windows, could watch people passing by. And sometimes, when someone carried past with a freshly created portrait, shining with happiness or weeping with relief, Eilis nodded to them, approving, supporting, understanding. For each of them walked the same path she had, from pain to creation, from loss to preservation, from despair to hope, and in that lay the meaning of everything, not to bring back the dead, but to make love live forever. In canvas, in paints, in magic born from the deepest human feeling, in the echo of the soul, the end. The moon shone over Diagon Alley, its silver light falling on the cobblestones, on shop windows, on the old gallery where Eilis Cormyran's portrait smiled in the darkness. Somewhere in Emma Brockway's home, she conversed with her grandfather, laughing at his jokes, weeping with relief that he was still with her. Somewhere at Hogwarts, students passed portraits in the corridors, greeting them, sometimes stopping to listen to a story or receive advice. Somewhere in a quiet dwelling by a lake, that very lake where Eilis once lived, a young wizard painted a portrait of his wife who had died in childbirth, so their daughter could know her mother at least in this form. And all of them were part of a single great chain, created by a woman who could not let go and precisely for that reason created something that never needed to be let go. Memory. Love. Life after death, not for the body, but for the soul, an echo that lives forever. As it should be.